All right, it's acquisitions part 3, and we're almost done. In the past 2 lectures, I've covered budgeting and alternative funding and the ordering, receiving, and invoicing process. This video will cover the various ways resources can be acquired by libraries, including purchasing models available. I'm using the term purchasing broadly here to cover all means of acquiring access to resources through vendors. The availability of electronic resources has had publishing houses scrambling to find a model that works for them, providing them with a profit margin and isn't cumbersome or onerous for libraries. So there's all kinds of models out there. It's still kind of the wild west of purchasing models. In some cases, they have really been slow to adapt to this new format. And often when they have adapted to digitizing their resources, they've not made it easy and sometimes even impossible for libraries to provide those resources to their users. For instance, some publishers will have a digital copy of a book available for individuals to purchase, but not for libraries. Frankly, I think that's short-sighted of the publisher, but there's really nothing you can do about it if that's how they choose to make their resources available. Libraries used to operate in an ownership mode, meaning that the library wanted to own every resource that they purchased access to. They were the gatekeepers and conservators or preservers of information. With the advent of electronic resources, the cost to build or expand libraries and the increase in costs to purchase and maintain resources, ownership is not always the most ideal or feasible way of providing access to information. The concern with not owning a resource is that the library no longer controls what happens to it, and something that has been paid for can suddenly become unavailable. Publishers are still working out models that meet their needs, that of making money, while at the same time making the model reasonably priced with sufficient access to make it attractive to library media specialists. Purchasing models for electronic resources are likely to be evolving as technology changes. This is a jargon-rich area of the libraries, and as I mentioned before, I will explain what the terms mean, but if you don't need help understanding them, or if I'm using a term that I haven't explained, the online dictionary for library and information science is available in the text and resources page of Canvas. And it's an excellent resource, as I've said before, or just Google ODLIS, O-D-L-I-S. The first model for acquiring access to resources is probably the simplest, and it's called a firm order. The library media specialists know what they need, determines who they will purchase it through, then prepares and sends in the paperwork placing the order. The resource arrives at the library and is received and invoiced. The invoice is paid and the library owns the resource. So select, order, receive, invoice, and you own it. The basic purchasing process, order, receive, and invoice, is followed. This model works best for monographs such as books, DVDs, and even some ebooks. Monographs are resources that are intended to be published once and are complete in that publication. So most books are monographs, most DVDs are monographs. Most of what we think of as a library resource is a monograph. There are some variations on this basic model. One of these is the standing order. This is essentially an order for a monograph that doesn't close, but continues for every new edition of the monograph. These new editions are usually published about once every year or so. This type of publication pattern is called a continuation. It differs from serials in that the original publication of the resource was not intended to go on, but due to popularity and even if it can be just up to the author, they've decided to update it once every year, every 2 years, it becomes a continuation. If a library media specialist wants his library to have the newest edition of these titles, A standing order is the best way to ensure that they receive it without having to keep track of when new editions come out. An example of these types of resources are the Guinness World Book of World Records or the Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association. Almanacs are also a well-known type of continuation that can be ordered through a standing order process. Standing orders save the time of the LMS. They don't have to monitor these titles that they know they want to add to the collection, and they know they won't miss an edition when it's published. Depending on the title, the frequency can be set up on a less than annual basis so that expensive titles don't have to be replaced each year, but maybe every other year or every 5 years. Standing orders are billed at the point of shipment. The LMS needs to know the likely cost of standing orders in a given year and when they will receive them so that they can ensure that they have enough funds set aside to pay for the resources when they are sent. So standing orders are a bit similar to serials in that you have to set the funds aside and make sure that they're not spent so that when you receive them, you have enough money to pay for them. Approval plans are another type of firm order. They are profiles set up with a vendor from which resources that fit the profile are sent. After the library receives the item, the library media specialist determines whether or not they want to keep them. The LMS pays for the titles they keep and sends back the titles that they don't keep. The library is billed at the point of shipment, but credited when titles are returned. If the profile is set up well, very few resources will need to be returned because they don't fit the collection development plan or the library's needs. And that benefits both publisher and library to fine-tune that profile to make sure that you're not being sent resources that you're not going to want to keep. The profile can be fine-tuned or tweaked to make sure it's excluding materials that are not of interest to the librarian, such as appropriate age, grade, reading level, subject area, etc. This saves the time of the librarian since they don't have to seek resources to purchase. The shipments can be stopped and started at any time, so the need to set aside funds is not as crucial as it is with standing orders. However, it is more difficult to know how much to set aside as it's unknown what's going to be published that fits the profile every year. Setting up an agreement with a vendor to ship a library all the Caldecott and Newbery Award-winning books is an example of an approval plan. This is a good way to fill gaps in the collection with current resources. The profile could be tailored to fit a specific subject area and age or grade range. So, for instance, say you wanted to get the latest materials in science that were aimed at the high school age range, and you wanted to narrow it down to, say, biology and more specifically on cells. You could craft an approval plan that would send you resources that fit that criteria, that they're about cells, they are in the high school age range, and they'll send those to you, and then you get to keep what you want and send back the ones that you don't want. An approval plan is really useful if you know the types of resources you want to get and aren't concerned about specific titles. An economical way of purchasing access to electronic resources are as a package. The library pays less per title than they would have if they had purchased each title individually, so more bang for the buck. And it's quite a big difference. It can be quite a big difference. However, the packages are fairly expensive. So the downside is if you don't have the funds to purchase a package, then you won't be able to take advantage of that discount. It also benefits the publisher because they are able to get more resources into libraries, which lowers the cost per resource for them. Since this is a purchase, the library will have access to the resources as long as the publisher remains viable or they sell their resources to a viable publisher. While there is only a one-time purchase price, an annual access fee might also need to be paid and should be accounted for when budgeting each year. So when electronic books were kind of a new phenomenon, libraries were quite reluctant to sort of step into that area of purchasing because the uncertainty of the stability of the resource or of the vendor who's providing access to that resource. Sometimes when you purchase an ebook or an ebook package, you can download the data onto your server, but that means you are required to own a server that has large enough memory capacity to be able to hold that data. Usually, though, the data is kept with the publisher. Now, early on, NetLibrary and the article that you're reading, he discusses NetLibrary. They're no longer a viable publisher. They have gone out of existence. And when libraries purchased into NetLibrary, they were one of the first ebook vendors. And then they sold, what happened was they sold all of their stock, or whatever you want to call it, to EBSCO. And EBSCO is a very viable ongoing vendor. So those libraries who had purchased those resources still had access, but only the access through EBSCO now. So publishers are still working this sort of thing out, but it has been shown that there's less of a concern about losing access to those resources that you purchase because of the ability of vendors to sell their stock to another vendor and keep it available. Historically, library collections have been developed with a just-in-case mindset or philosophy of collection development. The idea behind just-in-case is that libraries have traditionally made resources available to the community just in case they might be interested in them or need them at some point. With demand-driven acquisitions, or DDA, or sometimes called PDA, a resource is purchased only after it has received a certain number of uses and has demonstrated its value to the library community. This is considered a just-in-time philosophy of collection development. So the resource is available just in time that it's needed. This purchasing model is used for electronic books. The library provides access to a package of ebooks from a vendor, and these ebooks can be accessed through the catalog as well as through the vendor's database interface. The library pays a nominal charge each time a book is accessed, and when the book has been accessed a certain number of times or has been used a certain length of time, the library is charged the cost to purchase the book. The patron's experience is absolutely seamless. They have no idea that they've crossed that sort of access point to purchase point. And the library is charged the cost of the purchase. So all of that goes on behind the scenes. If the library should no longer provide access to the ebook package, they still retain access to the titles that were purchased. Murray State Library does have a DDA program in place. It's through EBL, and we've provided over 20,000. I know it's over 20,000 titles that are available through the catalog. So you can search the catalog for a resource, click on the link, even get into the book and start reading it and using it. And then again, if any of those trigger points are hit, such as it's used, I think, over 4 times, or it's one user has used it for a long period of time, I don't know what the threshold is, then we purchase it, and the user has no idea that the resource has just been purchased. So we're billed for the cost of the resource, and we own it. Resources such as magazines, journals, and newspapers are referred to as serials or periodicals, and they are intended to be an ongoing publication with no specified end date. These resources are purchased through subscriptions. Subscriptions are paid at the point of order, and a subscription usually lasts for a year. although multiple years can be paid for in order to receive a discount. Often the subscription starts, or once the subscription starts, the individual issues of that serial are received when they're published. In addition to print resources, subscriptions can also be used to provide access to databases and electronic periodicals as well. Access to databases is given once a licensing agreement is signed by the institution, and then the institution is billed for that. If a library decides to stop paying for a print subscription, they will not receive any future issues, but will be able to keep the issues for which they've already paid. However, if the library decides to discontinue payment for a database or other electronic resource, they will no longer have access to that resource. So that's kind of the downside about accessing periodicals electronically. Before I get to the consortiums, I did want to make a note about electronic resources. There's always a license in place that needs to be agreed to. There's a point that you can negotiate the terms of that license. Sometimes e-resource providers have a limited number of users that can use the resource at the same time, or they charge a higher amount for your full-time student count, depending on where you fall. So there's a variety of ways that electronic resources are purchased and financed, and you'll need to work that out with the vendor and negotiate that in the license. So on to consortial purchases. Often libraries find it more feasible to join with other libraries in order to use their purchasing power to negotiate lower costs, a reduction in fees, or to share costs for expensive resources. Usually consortial purchases are made to provide access to an electronic resource such as an ebook package or indexing database. They can also negotiate with a vendor for higher discounts or lower fees for print resources when they agree to spend a certain amount of money each year. A group of libraries can become a consortium simply for the sake of purchasing the resource, or may already be an existing consortium. So you don't need to already be an existing consortium to call yourself one and take advantage of consortial level pricing. You can just form a consortium because you and another library want to have access to a resource that's too expensive for either one of you to pay for individually, but that you can share the cost and both have access to. The groups will often determine the cost of the resource for each library based on a formula or percentage, which usually takes into account factors such as the number of students served, the library's budget, and collection size. Kentucky Virtual Library, or KYVL, is a Kentucky state consortium that libraries can join for a fee. That fee pays for access to digital resources and also makes some resources available for free to any library in the state. Larger libraries, such as the academic university libraries, subsidize the cost for the smaller libraries with smaller budgets. We pay a higher share of the cost so that the smaller libraries can still have access to the resources. Licensed databases are available to member libraries. Libraries of all public school, university, and colleges, as well as public libraries, are members. Hospital libraries, special libraries, and independent school libraries may also join. The membership fee contributes toward the cost of licensing the databases and is determined by a formula. Additionally, a courier service is available for interlibrary loans for those libraries that join. This makes it possible for libraries in a school district, for instance, to share their resources, or for libraries, in one part of the state to share resources with another part of the state without having to send things through the mail. Renting. Renting resources is a way of providing access that it's primarily used by public libraries. Usually multiple copies of high-use resources, often fiction bestsellers, are rented. The advantage of renting is the ability to avoid paying the full cost of the resource plus processing costs. When the resource is no longer in high use, libraries that rent don't have to allocate shelf space or go to the effort of withdrawing multiple copies. So they can have these multiple copies available when the demand asks for it, and then when the demand backs off, they can send those back to the vendor that they're renting from and not have to bother with some of the details that would need to be in place if they were withdrawing them. School libraries may consider renting resources if there's a resource they know will have a high interest for a short period of time and they don't want to purchase a lot of copies. Gifts. Check to see if the district office has a policy regarding donations. The collection management policy for the library should include a section on gifts that supports and complies with the district's policy. This should include how or if gifts can be donated, if there are limits to what is accepted, what the library will do with donations, and who to contact for people to make donations. The library should have a form that they give to anyone donating to the library that acknowledges the extent of the gift and includes a clear statement of the right of the library media specialist to make the final determination about what will happen with the gift. While donations of books or other resources are appreciated, not every title donated should be added to the collection. The library media specialist should use the same criteria that they use for purchasing resources to determine whether a donated book should be added to the curriculum or to the collection. Conditions for accepting the resource should not restrict the ability of the library media specialist to determine whether it will go in the collection, which collection it will go in, when it needs to be withdrawn, and how it will be disposed of. In other words, once a resource has been given to a library, the donor should relinquish all control over it. There should be no strings attached. It's important to keep in mind that gifts are not free. The costs that are associated with gifts have to do with the time it takes to determine if it should be added to the collection, such as searching for duplicates, reading reviews, determining if it enhances the collection, etc. The cost of cataloging and processing, the space it takes on the shelf, and the cost to withdraw it. While all donors should be treated with appreciation and graciousness for considering the library as recipients of the gift, this should not obligate the LMS to include it in the collection materials that are not suitable for it. No gift should be accepted that comes with strings attached, unless the library media specialist and principal determine that the benefit of the gift outweighs the burden of whatever the expectation of the donor is. The LMS should feel free to dispose of the gifts as they see fit. Stipulations from the donor can restrict the ability of the LMS to make appropriate decisions about the donation for the collection and the community and cause her additional work, taking her away from other tasks that need to be done. So, for instance, if a donor said, I'd like to donate this box of books to the library, but if you're not going to add them, I want to be able to pick them up and take them back. I don't want you to just get rid of them. Well, the burden of that is that then the library media specialist has to set aside other things that might need to be done and focus on processing that box to see if the resources are going to be added to the collection or not. She'll have to keep track of which ones get added, which ones don't get added, and then contact the donor when she's done looking through the box to come pick up the resources. So that just adds an extra layer of burden to the library media specialist that is really unnecessary. If the donor doesn't want the library media specialist to dispose of things that they're not going to add to the collection, then it's probably better if they just don't accept the donation at all. Donations are a good way for people to express their appreciation or honor someone and are a great way to add to the collection. Have a list of titles you would like to add to the collection available for anyone who would like to purchase a book or other resource for the library. You can also create a wish list for the library in Amazon or with Scholastic when you have a book fair. Setting up a way to, for instance, purchase a book to honor a graduate is a good way for the library to be an advocate, the library media specialist to be an advocate for the library, to make a connection with the community outside of the school, and add to the collection. Many libraries participate in exchange lists. Resources that libraries are withdrawing and that are in good condition, or gifts that have not been added, are posted on the list, available to any library that is willing to pay the cost to ship them. This is an excellent way of filling gaps in periodical subscriptions or missing volumes of sets. It usually only costs the cost of the shipping. Public school libraries have to be careful about disposing of resources that have been purchased with taxpayer funds this way, as there are often restrictions about selling or giving resources away. That's the end of Acquisitions Part 3. Next week we will start talking about cataloging and classification, a very big shift in how we're going to be doing things. Make sure you have the required text, as we will be using that to do assignments in. So you have to have that text. All right. See you next week.